Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping into a totally different decade.
Oh, really? What are we thinking?
The 1970s.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, we're going back to the 70s, but, maybe not for the reasons you might immediately think. I'm thinking, disco and bell-bottoms and all that.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating decade, though. A lot happened.
It is. But we're specifically diving into the rise of affirmative action.
Interesting.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that even President Nixon plays a role in this story.
Oh, wow. That's not what I would have guessed.
Yeah, so, I mean, given, his reputation, I think it's safe to say that wasn't necessarily expecting that.
Yeah.
So we've got this lecture. It's called The Rise and Challenges of Affirmative Action in the 1970s.
Okay. Sounds thorough.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that's where I want to start. What were those challenges? I mean, for people who might not be super familiar with this, like, where do we even begin with affirmative action in this period?
Well, the 1970s, it was a really pivotal time for civil rights. You had, the momentum from the 60s, the civil rights movement still pushing forward.
Yeah, so it wasn't like, okay, problem solved.
Not at all. The fight for equality was definitely not over, even though you had a lot of landmark legislation passed in the 60s. Systemic discrimination was and is still a major problem.
So you're talking about, I guess, the idea that discrimination is built into our institutions.
Exactly. It's not just about individual acts of prejudice. It's about how those prejudices get embedded in our laws, in our policies, in our everyday practices.
So, like, it's bigger than just one bad apple.
Yes, much bigger. And that's why the role of the federal government becomes so crucial in the 70s. You start to see the Supreme Court, the president, taking real action to address these systemic issues.
So not just protests anymore.
Right. This is about making those demands for equality concrete, turning them into actual policy.
Okay, so what kind of policies are we talking about? What were some of the key things that happened?
One of the biggest turning points was a Supreme Court case called Griggs v. Duke Power Company in 1971.
Okay.
And this case basically established the idea that even if a company's hiring practices don't explicitly say we're discriminating, they can still be discriminatory if they have a disparate impact on minority applicants.
Oh, so like even if it doesn't say it outright, the result is still discriminatory.
Exactly. So even if a company says, oh, everyone has to pass this test or everyone needs this qualification, if those requirements end up disproportionately excluding minorities, well, that's still discrimination.
I see. So companies couldn't just hide behind like neutral-sounding rules anymore.
Exactly. They had to actually prove that their practices were fair and weren't putting up unnecessary barriers for minorities.
So that must have been a huge shift for a lot of companies.
It was. And it really helped to level the playing field, at least in theory.
But, I mean, this is where Nixon comes in, right?
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting. So in 1972, Nixon signed the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which strengthened the enforcement powers of the EEOC, the agency responsible for making sure companies are following these rules.
Okay.
But here's the really surprising part. Nixon also decided to extend affirmative action to federal contractors.
Wait, hold on. I thought Nixon was wasn't he a conservative?
He was, but he actually pushed for this expansion of affirmative action and had a massive impact. We're talking about over 250,000 companies suddenly needing to demonstrate that they were actively hiring and promoting minorities.
So are you telling me that Nixon, Mr. Law and Order Nixon, was actually a champion for affirmative action?
It might seem counterintuitive, but yes, he played a significant role in expanding these policies.
That is really surprising. I mean, you don't often hear about that side of Nixon.
It's a great example of how complex this history really is.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage for the backlash that starts to build later in the decade.
So we've got Nixon shaking things up in the early 70s, pushing for affirmative action in a way that a lot of people probably wouldn't expect. But then you mentioned a backlash.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? What sparked it?
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, not everyone was on board with these changes, right?
Right.
Affirmative action, it was a controversial policy from the start, and it still is today.
Yeah, definitely.
But a lot of the pushback, I think it really came to a head with a landmark Supreme Court case in 1978. Bakke v. Regents of the University of California.
Bakke. Okay, yeah, I think I remember hearing about this one. Wasn't like the case with the white student Ellen Bakke who claimed he was unfairly denied admission to medical school because of, like, the university's affirmative action policy?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bakke's argument was basically that he was a victim of reverse discrimination.
Reverse discrimination.
He said that he had better test scores, better grades than some of the minority students who were admitted, and he believed that he was rejected solely because of his race.
So the Supreme Court, what did they say? Did they get rid of affirmative action altogether?
It's actually a pretty nuanced decision.
Okay.
So they said that strict racial quotas were unconstitutional.
Okay, so schools couldn't just set aside a certain number of spots for minority students.
Right. But the court also said that race could still be considered as one factor among many in admissions decisions.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't a complete ban on affirmative action, but it definitely put some limits on it.
Exactly. And this decision, it really sparked a huge debate about what it means to have a level playing field. Because some people felt that any consideration of race in admissions was inherently unfair,
Right.
while others argued that it was absolutely necessary to overcome centuries of systemic discrimination, that you couldn't just ignore that history.
Yeah, so this case really brought up those questions of fairness,
Yeah.
Meritocracy, what does equal opportunity actually mean?
It's a Pandora's box, for sure. And it's not just about this one case. This is all happening against the backdrop of a changing political landscape.
Right.
The 1980s are coming, and with it, the rise of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan. He was not a fan of affirmative action, was he?
No, not really. Reagan was much more in line with the folks who saw affirmative action as government overreach.
Okay.
He really emphasized individual responsibility, free markets, and he saw affirmative action as interfering with that.
So it's like we see this back and forth, this tension
Yeah.
between those who see affirmative action as like a way to address these historical wrongs, and then those who are really concerned about fairness and maybe even see it as, another form of discrimination.
You got it. And this tension, it's reflected in how historians themselves interpret the impact of affirmative action.
Oh, interesting. So even historians don't all agree on this.
Nope, not at all. Actually, in this lecture, they talk about 4 main schools of thought when it comes to understanding affirmative action, especially in this period.
4 schools of thought. Okay, I'm curious. What are they?
So first you have what we call liberal historiography.
Okay.
And liberal historians, they tend to view affirmative action as a really crucial tool for righting past wrongs.
Oh, okay.
They argue that it's absolutely essential to dismantle those structural barriers that have prevented minorities from achieving true equal opportunity.
So for them, it's about more than just like individual cases of discrimination.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that historical injustice has a very real impact on people's lives even today.
So it's like you can't just say, okay, well, discrimination's illegal now. Everyone has a fair shot. It's more complicated than that.
Way more complicated. And that's a key point for liberal historians. But of course, you've got other historians who see things differently.
Okay, so what's the next school of thought?
The second one is what we call conservative historiography.
Conservative historiography, okay.
And as you might guess, conservative historians, they're often more focused on the idea of meritocracy.
Meritocracy, so like the idea that people should succeed based on their own abilities and hard work.
Exactly. And they're concerned that affirmative action might be giving an unfair advantage to some groups at the expense of others, regardless of individual merit.
So they're worried that it's actually undermining fairness, even if it's trying to achieve a greater good.
Yeah, that's a big part of their critique. They see it as potentially creating a new form of inequality, even as it tries to address an old one.
It's interesting how this ties into, like, our beliefs about individual responsibility.
Absolutely. And how we define success.
Okay, so we've got liberal and conservative historiography. You said there were 2 more.
Yep. The third perspective comes from critical race theory, or CRT.
CRT, okay. That's one we hear a lot about these days.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a hot-button issue. But essentially, CRT scholars, they argue that affirmative action, while it's a step in the right direction, it doesn't go far enough.
It's not enough to really address the problem.
Right. They see it as more of a Band-Aid than a cure. They argue that true equality requires a much more fundamental transformation of our institutions and our social structures.
So for them, affirmative action is kind of like treating the symptoms, but not the underlying disease of systemic racism.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about that 4th perspective? What's the last one?
The 4th one focuses on the economic side of things. It's called economic historiography.
Economic historiography. Okay, so what do they focus on?
Economic historians, they're really interested in the concrete effects of affirmative action on economic opportunities for minorities.
So they're looking at things like income, job access, that sort of thing.
Exactly. They point to the fact that these policies have played a significant role in opening doors for minorities in fields they were previously excluded from. Things like higher education, professional careers, all of that.
Okay, yeah. So they're more focused on measurable outcomes, less on the philosophical debates about fairness or what equality means.
Right. For them, it's about looking at the actual impact on people's lives, their economic well-being.
It's fascinating how one policy can be seen through so many different lenses.
It really is.
It speaks to how complex this whole issue is.
Absolutely.
But, before we get into the lasting impact of all this, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said the Bakke decision, it happened around the same time as this growing backlash against affirmative action.
Yeah.
Especially with Reagan coming into office.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? What did this backlash actually look like in the 1980s?
Well, Reagan's election in 1980, it really did signal a big shift.
Mm-hmm.
His administration, they were very critical of what they saw as excessive government intervention.
Okay.
In all sorts of areas, social welfare, and definitely affirmative action.
Okay.
They really believed in, limited government, individual freedom.
Right.
And they saw affirmative action as the government stepping in where it didn't belong.
So did Reagan try to just get rid of affirmative action altogether?
He didn't eliminate the programs entirely, but he definitely weakened their enforcement
Okay.
and their scope.
Okay.
One of the biggest things he did was appoint conservative judges to the Supreme Court.
Ah, so he was changing the legal landscape.
Exactly. And these new judges, they were generally less sympathetic to arguments in favor of affirmative action.
So it became harder to defend these policies in court.
Right. And this shift in the courts, combined with this more conservative political climate, it really emboldened the people who had always opposed affirmative action.
Yeah, they felt like the tide was turning in their favor.
Exactly. They felt like things had gone too far.
It's interesting how much the fate of affirmative action seems tied to whoever's in power at the time.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something we see throughout history, right?
Yeah.
I mean, social movements, they gain momentum, they made progress, but then the political winds can shift.
Right.
And they face setbacks.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what are the long-term consequences of this push and pull between those who support and oppose affirmative action?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it leads us to some really important considerations about the legacy of these policies and what they tell us about the ongoing struggle for equality in America.
So we've gone from Nixon, surprisingly pushing for affirmative action to this backlash, the courts, Reagan, all of that. But where does that leave us? What's the lasting impact of all of this? Because, we're still talking about affirmative action today, so it's not like it just went away.
You're absolutely right. The impact of affirmative action has been huge, and it's still being felt today. And it's a mixed bag, really. There have been undeniable successes, but the debate definitely hasn't gone away.
Okay, so let's start with the successes. What are some of the positive things that came out of affirmative action?
Well, one of the most significant outcomes has been the increased representation of minorities in all kinds of fields.
Okay.
Higher education, professional careers,
Mm-hmm.
you name it.
So there's no doubt that affirmative action opened doors for a lot of people who might not have had those opportunities otherwise.
Right. We've seen a much more diverse workforce. We see minorities in leadership positions. And there's a greater recognition of the talents and contributions of people from all different backgrounds. Those are real achievements.
But like you said, the controversy hasn't gone away.
Not at all.
We still see these debates about affirmative action, and a lot of it comes down to this idea of fairness.
That's true. The debate has evolved over time, but it always comes back to those fundamental questions about equality, justice, and what it actually means to have a level playing field.
Yeah.
Some people they really believe that any consideration of race in admissions or hiring is just inherently discriminatory.
Right.
While others argued that you can't ignore the history,
Yeah.
you have to take into account the disadvantages that minority groups have faced and continue to face.
It seems like it comes down to different ideas of what equality means, Is it about treating everyone exactly the same, no matter their background?
Right.
Or is it about recognizing that because of historical injustices, some groups need specific help to catch up?
That's the heart of it. And honestly, there's no easy answer. Affirmative action has been praised as this, essential tool for social justice.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also been criticized as, another form of discrimination.
Yeah, reverse discrimination.
Exactly. And it forces us to look at these uncomfortable truths about our history and how difficult it really is to achieve true equality.
And then you add in the fact that the laws around affirmative action keep changing.
Oh, yeah.
There have been all these court cases
All the time.
challenging these policies, and a lot of institutions have had to, adjust their programs just to stay within the law.
It's a constantly shifting landscape.
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court has weighed in on a bunch of key cases over the years.
Yeah.
And their rulings have definitely led to more nuanced and limited approaches to affirmative action,
Okay.
moving away from those strict quotas
Right.
and focusing more on a holistic view of each applicant.
So it's not as simple as just saying yes or no to affirmative action.
It's so much more complicated than that.
There's a lot of gray area.
A lot of gray area. And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because how do you make sure that you're creating opportunities for these historically underrepresented groups without doing something that might seem unfair to others?
It's a tough balance.
It really is.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of, these broader debates about race and privilege, what equality really means. It's like affirmative action has become this focal point for all of these really big, complicated issues.
Absolutely. It touches on some of the most sensitive issues in our society.
So after looking at all of this history, the successes, the challenges, everything, what do you think is the most important question we should be asking ourselves as we move forward?
That's a good question. For me, it comes down to this. How do we get to a point where affirmative action is no longer necessary? How do we actually fix the root causes of inequality?
Yeah.
How do we get rid of those systemic barriers?
Yeah.
Those things that prevent people from having a fair shot?
So it's about going beyond affirmative action.
Yes.
Finding solutions that make it obsolete.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's really just a temporary fix.
Huh.
The real work is in creating a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone.
That's a powerful thought. It's like affirmative action, it was maybe necessary in the past. Maybe it's still necessary now.
Maybe.
But the goal should be to get to a place where we don't need it anymore. Where everyone has a genuine chance to succeed, regardless of their background.
Exactly. And that means addressing things like poverty, unequal access to education, all forms of discrimination.
Wow. Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Good.
I think we've all learned a lot about affirmative action, the history, the complexities, how relevant it still is today. And as we wrap up, I just want to leave our listeners with a final thought. What can each of us do to create that more just and equitable society? What actions can we take, big or small, to break down those barriers so that everyone has a chance to reach their full potential? Keep thinking about it, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.